I'm very glad to be given the opportunity to talk with Professor Rescher, Nicholas Rescher, who is one of the most famous contemporary metaphysicians, about his philosophy. I would like to focus on three topics of your philosophical work. You have written a lot, especially on Leibniz philosophy. Let me start the interview by asking his very metaphysical question, why is there something rather than nothing? What would be your answer?
The answer to a philosophical question often consists in looking more deeply into the question and raising issues and problems in a rather remote way toward a conclusion. If we are persuaded that something like the principle of sufficient reason holds, so that every state of affairs, every condition of things has an explanation of something, then that it seems only plausible that fundamental question of why something exists in the world, why the world as such exists, is something that is bound to arise. Now, it's when one looks at that question, it's an extremely unusual and extraordinary question, because usually when we explain something, the existence of something, we look to a pre-existing condition of some sort, out of which that item that we're concerned about has developed or evolved or come to be. The difficulty here is that anything that we would use as a premise from which to proceed existentially to explain why a world exists, itself is part of that world and gets gobbled up into the problem, so that the idea of a standard explanation in terms of prior conditions of things is not workable. It's a very extraordinary question, and for an extraordinary question, you need an extraordinary answer. Now, there are two ways to move forward from that. One is the more traditional theological way, and in effect, Leibniz took that route. For him, there is a divine being, a divine creator. That creator, the problem of where that creator comes from is answered by essentially self-referential terms. It is a self-engendered being, doesn't require further external explanation because its explanation lies within itself, and then you have material from which to go forward, because that creator then can contemplate a range of possibilities for the outlet of his creative effort. He entertains all these alternative possibilities and selects one of them for actualization on the basis of essentially evaluative, axiological kind of consideration. So Leibniz has a fairly straightforward way of addressing the question of why the universe exists. If you are unwilling to accept a theological route to that explanation, the problem becomes accordingly more difficult, because now you don't have a self-engendered pre-existing starting point from which to proceed to explain the existence of other things. That's now sets in train a very, very difficult line of reflection, which has to argue that in the domain of fact, there is not really going to be, in that standard domain of factual reasoning, there isn't going to be an answer to that question. Now, that confronts you with an alternative, as always. One alternative is to say the question is illegitimate and inappropriate, it doesn't arise, it's a metaphysical question of a sort that we rigorous philosophers committed to the scientific point of view shouldn't even be asking. That's one line one can take, and that, of course, is the line taken by the logical positivists and by a major tradition of modern philosophy that wants to invalidate the metaphysical project altogether. I would prefer to take another route, and it's a route also suggested by Leibniz, namely to say, look, there are really two domains of deliberation. There is the domain of fact, and there is the domain of value. And in the final analysis, if you cannot get an explanation for the existence of things in the factual domain, you have to make a leap into the evaluative domain. Now, for Leibniz, the idea that value is the crux of existence comes about within the framework of his existential argument, because it is God's evaluation of possibilities that leads him to choose one of these for actualization. What you have to argue in the case where you want a purely axiological explanation of existence is the much more difficult idea that there is a principle at work which resembles Leibniz's principle of optimality, but that principle is self-validating, that the existence of a fact has to be explained in terms of the existence of value by showing that fact is in the range of evaluative possibilities the optimum. And the question of why is it that the principle of optimality should obtain is itself self-supporting. That is to say, it obtains because it is for the best. It is the best option within the range of the possible. So it's that kind of metaphysic which tries to extract actuality from possibility via value is extremely eccentric, but if you are deeply committed to a rationalization, that is a rational explanation for things, you are driven in that general direction, because it is, so to speak, the only sort of semi-self-substantiating game in town.
Yeah, thank you very much. So my next question would be about truth. You have also developed a theory of truth. My question is, what is truth and how should we define it in terms of correspondence or coherence? What would you say about truth?
I would like to have it both ways, as philosophers often want to do but find it difficult to do. I think that there is a great deal to be said for the correspondence theory of truth if you look at the matter from the angle of definitional explanations. What is it to claim that something or other is truly and really the case? Well, it's to say that accords with what reality is like, a classical principle of ad aequatio ad rem. So that the correspondence to the actual state of things is a key to the idea of what it is to claim something to be true, what a truth claim involves. Now, the difficulty in which we find ourselves is that for us, situated epistemically where we are, the only way to get at the truth is through inquiry, through a process of trying to seek out what the truth is. And at that point, where we're looking for the criteriology of truth, that is to say, what we're in an epistemic position reasonably to claim to be true, is something which has to take a coherentist line. It is that possibility among the range of possibilities that best accords systemically with what we can get hold of, with our experience, with the data of experience, and with the results of inquiry. So coherence, fitting together into an overall rational pattern of claims which is in alignment with what the evidence indicates to us, a fundamentally coherentist approach is the optimum possibility for resolving the question of what to regard as being true, what to accept as being true, to the epistemological issue of truth verification. But that once we go through that process, what we claim and what we're entitled to claim on the basis of accepting something of truth is this correspondentist view that is really what things are like. So it's a truth theory that combines on the definitional side a correspondentist approach, but on the epistemological confirmationist side a view of the coherence standard as operative.
Yeah, thank you very much. So my third and final question concerns process philosophy. You have written a lot of books on this topic. So my question would be, what is process philosophy and what are its advantages over other approaches? Could you demonstrate it with an example, for example?
Well, the issue relates to the kind of stance we're going to take toward the ontological project, toward the attempt to give a coherent account of what the reality in which we are emplaced is like. And among philosophers, the tradition in Western thought has been very heavily geared to the idea that things, substances, items of existence, sometimes construed as physical existence, as in atomism, sometimes construed much more broadly in a Platonic sense, that there are both ideal and physical objects, but that in any event, the nature of philosophical understanding has to proceed on the basis of a concern for substances, things, persons as a type of that, individual items which have an independent identity and ongoing existence of their own. That's the sort of classical point of view. The process philosophers want to say that there is an alternative to this perspective, an alternative that goes back to perhaps Heraclitus with the idea that everything is in flux, that really what there is in existence is a series of occurrences, events, coherently organized in change or in changes which connect them, which make for flows of processuality within the scheme of things, and that the things that we ordinarily think of are in some way or other both the result and the manifestation of these processes, so that the idea of occurrence, events, chains of development, and so on, is the fundamental way in which to understand what goes on in the world, and that the things that we deal with are really waves of stability in a sea of process, to speak very figuratively, and that therefore our concern ought less to be shaped by the traditional logic of thing and substance, of item and attribute, but that we have a better handle on how things work in the world if we think of what goes on in terms of processes and sequences of development, when things have a natural systemic structure of development, so that a person, for example, quite typically, is to be thought of as a series of process stages connected in a whole variety of physical and conceptual ways, so that the basic unit is not somehow a stable item, but is this flow of events connecting what goes on in the world into separable but nevertheless interconnected combinations of interaction.
Yeah.
So that's roughly the idea of process philosophy, is as a contrast to substance philosophy, to say that if we want to understand things, mathematics is a much better guide than logic, because logic is based on stable identities which really don't exist in the world. That what goes on is much better described in the kind of terms of sequential development that you have with equations as you manipulate them in calculus, where you have functional relationships which connect things into sequences of development that are descriptive only at the systemic level.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Rescher, for this very illuminating interview.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to deal very briefly with very complicated issues.
Yeah.